Greetings, dear listeners. I should put that in the plural. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Have a great friend of the pod, and I don't just mean John Padoritz, friend of the podcast, here today. And he was supposed to be on last week, but I had a huge scheduling screw up, and he graciously agreed to kick it to the next week. Back when I was at NR, I'd always call him National Review's movie reviewer who had a side gig at the New York Times. But now I can do it the other way around. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat and National Review movie reviewer. Great to have you back.
It's great. It's great to be back. And the one person listening to this podcast, I think, is gonna. They're in for a treat.
Yeah. Hi, Mrs. Douthat.
No chance of that, Jonah.
Well, I was thinking maybe your wife. All right, so we had not planned on doing this as a Iowa Caucus post-mortem thing because we were supposed to talk last week and that didn't happen. But now this is the morning after, as it were. Proverbially, yeah. Jason Robards is living off puddle water in 1980s nuclear torn Iowa. What's he make with the punditry? Go now.
Donald Trump is going to be the Republican nominee for president, I think, in 2024, Jonah. I know it's a sort of outlandish to think that a reality television star and, celebrity entrepreneur could possibly win a Republican primary. He's been divorced a lot, he's got some sex scandals, and yet somehow here we are. Yeah, it was pretty boring, I would say. There was sort of the mild interest of figuring out if Ron DeSantis would defeat Nikki Haley by 2 percentage points, or Nikki Haley would defeat Ron DeSantis by 2 percentage points. But the polls were correct. Trump won easily. I don't really see a path to beating him. And it's, I mean, the punditry is sort of limited here, right?
Yeah, no, I hear you, but we have to cover it.
I think right. Well, I think the thing I as a good pundit, I had to write a take last night, right? And the take. So one take has been that Trump's indictments turned this race into a foregone conclusion, that there was, a real chance that someone, probably Ron DeSantis, could have given him a race before he was indicted. And you can see in the polls the kind of rally effect just sort of took all of the air out of rival non-Trump campaigns, in which case this race has been boring for a long time. I think there's truth to that. I said in the column, though, that, if you look at the results, Trump is basically running as a kind of quasi-incumbent, and he still only won 51% of the vote. Haley and DeSantis combined for 42% of the vote. If there had been one candidate who could win that 40% of the vote, I think Trump would still be on a path to the nomination, but we would have kind of an interesting race ahead of us. So even with the indictments, had DeSantis been a stronger candidate and prevented Haley's campaign from taking off, or had there been no, intense rush to Haley by a certain group of donors and supporters, then maybe there would have been a more interesting race. Again, even with the indictments. So that was my rank punditry last night. But either way, I don't know. I mean, I'm curious if you think there's any chance of a sort of New Hampshire surprise changing the complexion of this race. I don't, but what do you think?
Well, complexion is a funny word. It doesn't quite imply trajectory. And so, look, first of all,
New Hampshire could give us something to write about, right?
Yes.
For the several weeks before South Carolina. So that
yeah, I mean, you can kind of easily see a John McCain kind of replay, right? Where McCain has had a big win in New Hampshire, and then things get really ugly in South Carolina. and the winner of Iowa goes on to win, right? And like that, I think is the most likely, not the most likely, it's the most likely interesting scenario, and it's not an unlikely scenario in its own right. And it would be very sad to see Nikki crash and burn in her home state, but I think she would. Maybe not by the margins we see now. Um, that said, look, I agree with you. I've been saying for a long time that the way to look at this is that we're going to have a race between two weak incumbents. And the funny thing about incumbents when incumbents run, it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about lanes or conventional constituencies because there are people who come from different constituencies who just support the incumbent because they're Republicans, right? Or they're party loyalists or whatever. And I think that's a more fruitful way of looking at trying to look at this data is that you don't get a real clean sense of sure, rural non-college educated MAGA voters that if this was Trump's first time running for whatever reason, like, or if Trump wasn't running, that's who DeSantis would be getting a lot of, maybe, and that kind of stuff. That's the MAGA lane. But I think it's Trump crowds out all that stuff, and he's running as a very weak incumbent. I thought you were right in your column about this, and it does set up a real question of how he can win if you think about the way previous primary challenges have hurt incumbent presidents. The idea that you're going to get all of these people to come back together, plus moderates, independents, all that kind of stuff, seems unlikely. And then, of course, this is the problem. This is why our job sucks these days. It's very hard to see how Trump wins, right?
Pity the pundits.
That's right. It's very, very hard to see how Trump wins, but it's really easy to see how Biden loses.
Yep.
And sort of,
you just have to look at the poll that literally the I think it was CBS, right, that came out 2 days ago that had, it had DeSantis, Haley, and Trump all doing about the same against Biden, beating him by 3 points. And I think Haley it might have been 4 or 5 for Haley, right?
I think Haley was outside the margin of error, unlike
outside the margin of error, right? So that's the Haley. The case for Haley is I'll win outside the margin of error, but that also has been, I think, not as important as the indictments, but an important part of this story. Trump looked at his weakest immediately after 2022, when the sort of all of the Trumpiest candidates went down to defeat. The Republican Party massively underperformed in spite of winning the House. And the whole Biden strategy of, a noun and a verb in January 6th worked more to my own surprise. Like how I was surprised at how well it worked. And that seemed to sort of shake something loose in the Republican psyche, right? And create this sense of like, oh, wait, maybe, notwithstanding 2016, Donald Trump is not the world's biggest winner after all, right? But having then Biden slump in the polls so persistently over the last year and a half, it's just taken away what was briefly, for DeSantis especially, but then has sort of become for Haley this electability argument, right? Like, I do think it would make a difference if we were looking at polls that showed DeSantis or Haley beating Biden by 6 and Trump losing to Biden. You'd have headlines. Poll shows Biden beats Trump. That, would that be enough to dislodge Trump? Maybe not, but it would change the complexion of the race a little bit. And but having the polls show Trump beating Biden, it just makes, again, not just the core MAGA vote, but also the sort of regular Republicans who don't pay a lot of attention to politics and sort of decided they like Trump by the end. It makes them think, yeah, well, we can do this. We'll just do it again. It'll work. And it might.
It might. No, I agree. I think the electability argument was the best possible argument for both DeSantis and Haley when it looked like a good argument, but it doesn't look like a good argument anymore, right? And although DeSantis, his whole campaign, I think the postmortems on his campaign are going to be kind of fascinating. Nikki's postmortems, assuming there are some, it's going to be here's why we chose these words to say chaos follows him for good or for ill, and here's what a focus group said, and it'll be pretty straightforward and understandable. But the very online nature of DeSantis's early rollout, including the launch on Twitter, um,
Yes.
uh, that the theory of the case was that I think in some ways that they thought Twitter was real life, and they thought that they were going to run a post-Trump race while Trump wasn't in a post-Trump moment yet. And that's those two things are very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I just think there was a lot of deep confusion in the DeSantis campaign about what exactly they were doing, right? So they had that rollout, and that rollout seemed to be, you know, it seemed to be signaling that DeSantis is the guy who will bring in sort of basically a lot of people like Elon Musk who were sort of centrist liberals who don't like wokeness and don't like the left, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was sort of a vision of DeSantis as a kind of outreach candidate to, what you might call the sort of neoconservatives, the kind of people who read like Barry Weiss's Free Press a lot, and think that we're rooting against Harvard's president and that kind of thing, right? But who aren't conventional Republican voters. So that's like that's a kind of interesting pitch for who DeSantis is and would be, as disastrous as the actual Twitter rollout was. But then DeSantis didn't actually do anything on Twitter, right? Like the whole thing with Trump in 2016 was that he didn't just have Twitter frogs and and yeah, basically people on Twitter with frogs touting him and boosting him and so on. He was a Twitter personality himself. He was like the center of the social media storm. I mean, DeSantis has never struck me as the right guy to sort of do that and be that, but there was no attempt to actually put DeSantis, like make him a character on social media. Nothing like that ever happened. And then there was this kind of pivot to a Ted Cruz Iowa strategy, which is a completely different kind of strategy from an Elon Musk strategy, right? It's saying like, I'm the most socially conservative candidate in the race. You can't trust Trump because he's not a upright, decent guy, and you can trust me because I'm a family man and a true blue conservative. And this, I'm sure, this connects to having Jeff Rowe, who
Mm-hmm.
ran Ted Cruz's operation, as sort of one of your gurus, which again, I thought that was a little bit mystifying.
Yeah.
We watched the Ted Cruz campaign. It did not succeed, right? It's like a model for how to get Trump one-on-one and fall short, right? So, I mean, I could go on, but those were there was, just from the start, there was sort of this perplexing sense of like, well, what are we actually doing? What are we, how are we actually selling DeSantis? That again interacted with the fact that DeSantis is, as people pointed out from the start, not an especially charismatic figure. Someone in a way well suited to run a kind of frontrunners campaign, not
Mm-hmm.
that well suited to run a sort of underdog enthusiasm driven campaign, which he has failed to create. I'm
So I have
curious though. Can you mentioned before that like I thought your point about sort of these like ideological categories or lanes not making that much sense. I I think that's sort of true for voters. What's interesting is that it's not really true in our profession, right? Like there's a
mm-hmm.
very clear DeSantis Haley divide among not just like Twitter influencers, but among right of center writers and pundits and intellectuals, right? Like it is very clear that, you know, Haley was more the candidate of, the Dispatch, the Bulwark, the American Enterprise Institute, these sort of, those kind of places and people and publications. And DeSantis was more the candidate of people who were sort of trying to build some kind of populist intellectual infrastructure under Trump. But then if you watched their debate, where they, just tore into each other, if you just watch that on issues, except for Ukraine, you wouldn't have really been able to say, like, oh, clearly DeSantis stands for, national conservative populism, and Haley stands for a return to, George W. Bush or Mitt Romney, right? That there was just a sort of big gulf between the kind of pundit wars over their candidacies and how the actual politics ended up, I thought. I don't know. I was just curious what you thought about that.
Yeah, I was going to get to some of those questions about that because I have opinions. I think you're right as at a level of broad generalization. I don't know that was the bulwark in favor of Nikki Haley.
No. I mean, that's no. The bulwark was very conflicted about supporting Nikki Haley because they thought she was, too soft on Trump, right? So the bulwark,
right.
the bulwark was like Chris Christie.
Yeah,
that's fair to say.
Yeah, I'm not trying to get into a tongue war with the bulwark thing, but the bulwark, ever since they sort of bought into this, should we burn down the GOP kind of framework, which I always thought it was sort of like, should Liechtenstein destroy the Soviet Union? I mean, it's not a thing, right? And I don't say that to be cruel because, like, I'm with them. I was with them on a lot of these points. It's just like, I had these debates with them, and this whole sort of like, should we burn it all down argument begged the question of whether or not we had any matches or any ability to do any of that kind of stuff. And but their framework seems to have gone very far in that direction, pox on all their houses, and
right. No, even to the extent that they leaned Haley, they were not invested in her candidacy.
Right. So I think
other people were.
Yeah, no, and I would say
I shouldn't. It's not over.
Yeah,
she can
right, exactly. At a level of broad generalization, without getting into specific writers and whatnot, I think one thing, the way you divide the sociology between DeSantis and Haley people, I think is in our profession, in our milieu, as we take a tour d'horizon of our profession.
You've been hanging out in Paris a lot. It really shows, Jonah.
So no, I think that one way to think about it, one way I think about it in my head, because I would be totally happy to have Ron DeSantis as the nominee instead of Donald Trump, right? Like, that's not a hard thing. I think his presidency, I think he's very wrong on the Ukraine stuff, and I think his answers on the Ukraine stuff are very badly reasoned. But I also don't think that that's more as authentically him as he sounds in real life. I think there's a lot of posing going on there. But regardless, that doesn't matter. I think for the most part, he's a conservative guy. I don't like what he did with Disney. There's some things I disagree with, but I think the difference sociologically at the 30,000 foot level is the people like DeSantis are conservatism first, fix conservatism first, secure conservatism's victories first, build the conservative coalition first. The Republican Party will follow. And the way I would characterize sort of my views is we're not going to fix the problems with conservatism until we fix the problem with the weakness of the Republican Party. And the whole point of, like, and I have full disclosures. I like Nikki. I know Nikki. My wife worked for Nikki. They have nothing to do with her campaign. I have major criticisms of lots of things she's done. But she is the kind of candidate that actually can put together a winning presidential coalition of right? That is, she puts together a bunch of people. She has enough of the base, but not a lot of it. She could use more. College-educated Republicans. She's appealing across the aisle. And so for me, the appeal of her is that she is the kind of candidate you need if you're going to have a Republican Party that actually wants to start behaving like a party. Forget the ideology for a second, but to be a winning coalition party, a party that is aiming to get 55, 60% of the vote in a presidential election, rather than a party that thinks, oh, if we just poke with cattle prods our base one more time, we can win basically with just the base. And, that's the Jeff Rowe, Ted Cruz model. That is the
Yep.
model of Donald Trump. And that is a guaranteed 45% coalition that maybe can get to 48%. And so I think one of the reasons why the DeSantis and Haley people kind of talk past each other is that, people like our friend Michael Brennan Doherty, he's all about the issues, right? Taking on this fight, taking on that fight, taking on DEI and foreign policy and the neocons and all that kind of stuff. And I have my disagreements with Michael on that kind of thing. But at the same time, we probably agree on far more than we disagree about. But I think that the way we fix the problems in our politics are by having strong parties again and having parties that want to win a majority of the public. And that's not the primary consideration, nor should it be necessarily for like National Review crowd, right? National Review is about the conservative movement. That's why I love the place. But I think that the problems we face in our politics have to do with the utter institutional decrepitude, one might even say decadence, of the political parties. And anyway, that's what I think the conflict of visions here is. It's like,
right, but again, this is sort of it's weird that DeSantis. I agree with you that that's sort of part of who ended up supporting DeSantis. So DeSantis was sort of one part populist infrastructure builders and another, or would be infrastructure builders, people who, agreed with you about the limits on Trump, but thought there was sort of a version of Trumpism that could be used to build to 53, 54%. And then one part sort of kind of ideological movement conservatives, right, who were sort of primarily devoted to a set of sort of traditional conservative issues. The thing with DeSantis was that his success in Florida seemed to show that he could be the guy who could hold this together but also be a 53%, 54% guy. And I mean, I guess, you could say that, well, that was based on a set of issues that that either went away in the case of COVID, or shifted in the case of sort of wokeness and DEI to a point where voters were briefly very concerned about those things and then became less concerned as it seemed like the Great Awakening was ebbing, right? And that so once those were two things that were sort of drawing people to DeSantis, people who are not sort of just conventional conservatives. But then, as those issues diminished, he didn't have another pitch to those kind of voters. And so he fell back on the Jeff Rowe, Ted Cruz model. I guess the question with Haley is what I mean. Haley's pitch in a general election right now. I mean, any Republican's pitch in a general election right now is that Joe Biden is too old and his economy has been bad and the world is a mess, right? And that's clearly a pretty strong pitch, but it's not sort of the basis for a governing coalition. It's not clear to me what the strong Haley-led party would do itself.
No, that's fair, and I mean the both the critique and both the upside and downside of Nikki Haley is she's a good politician. And the problem is in this political moment, and for a while now, being a politician is being called a politician is sort of like being called a bureaucrat, right? It's the negative connotation overpowers the positive side, even though we all want actually really good, competent bureaucrats. We should also want really good, competent politicians. And so I agree. Like she's very much a generic Republican circa 2015 or 2014, let's say. And I agree with you that DeSantis began making an argument that I've always agreed with him on about this culture of losing stuff, about this sort of, not wanting to be a majority party, not trying to actually win. And he tried to lean into his winning in Florida stuff. My problem with that always was his personality never came across as like he's the guy who turned Florida red. He benefited enormously from two really craptacular opponents in his elections. And the and this idea that he was getting all these things done because he was such a competent politician. It's very easy to seem like a super competent politician when you have commanding majorities in your legislature. And the mismatch between, I'm not saying he wasn't good at getting stuff done behind the scenes, and I always thought he was more of a wonk than people give him credit for, but he just didn't come across as a compelling, charismatic personality. And I wish that didn't matter, but it does. And
it appears to matter. Yes.
Yeah. So, but like, so getting back to this, I mean, I think you're right. Like our friend Ramesh Ponnuru had a good piece in the Washington Post, I think yesterday, talking about how unbelievably muddled the GOP is on policy stuff, and I think that any attempt to forge an ideological consensus that I would like, or that you would like, or that sincere Trumpist type populists would like, or hardcore neocon, whatever, doesn't really matter, because there's just a fundamental incoherence in and a the amount of self contradiction in what Trump is in favor of has yielded a Republican electorate that just doesn't pay attention to policy issues whatsoever. I mean, you have Trump basically throwing the pro-life movement under the bus, and also 40 years of without any planning of what to do post Roe. And so the anti-Roe versus pro-life factions, if you even want to call them those, are splintering apart. What's Trump's position on healthcare? What's Trump's position on Social Security?
Yeah,
I mean,
these are empty questions.
Right. Or the questions answer themselves, right? and so in that climate, I mean, it's fascinating to me and a little reassuring that during the debates, because Trump wasn't there, they were largely about policy stuff, sometimes small ball and petty and nasty policy stuff. But like DeSantis sounds pretty Reaganite. Nikki sounds pretty Reaganite. Vivek Ramaswamy sounds like he was invented in a German lab to drive me crazy. But everyone else is
you are not a big Ramaswamy head, Jonah.
I'd loathe him.
I'm kind of surprised. I really thought, yeah. I mean, no. I think one thing you could say is that. So I, a long time ago, co-wrote a book with our mutual friend Reihan Salam, right, about the Republican Party becoming a more working class political party. And the argument that we made then was that this would encourage and also require some sort of rethink of the Republican Party's economic policies. And I think if you look at sort of what happened with Trump in 2016, the way that he ran, the issue set he ran on, sort of, trade, liberal promises on spending, that kind of stuff. You could say that we were, that sort of vindicated our argument, even if you didn't like anything Trump was proposing, even if you thought he was, a horrible demagogue. It still seemed like what you would expect from a more working class conservatism was some kind of this kind of economic populism. I think what you're seeing in 2024 is more that a big chunk of working class conservatism is just people who don't pay close attention to politics, don't have strong views on economic issues, and don't sort of have a policy ask at all, right? So, or not a really specific one beyond promise to have a good economy. And so you have DeSantis and Haley sort of fighting over the share of the GOP electorate that cares about policy, right? And those people are still by and large more Reaganite. And then the rest, the rest of the party, including a lot of people Trump has brought into the party, are populist, but in a way that can be sort of totally substance free, or at least that Trump can win while being totally substance free. I don't know how this maps at all onto future debates, but I think the idea that you're necessarily going to get some kind of clash between a Jonah Goldberg Republicanism and a J.D. Vance Republicanism in some future primary. Maybe that's wrong, or maybe it doesn't happen in any kind of clear clash of policy visions way.
Yeah, I just think it's absolutely impossible as long as Donald Trump is dominating the party. And this is something I think, look, there are a lot of people on the populist side of the conservative movement and the Republican Party and all that who got a lot of things right that I got wrong. But one thing I got right, and they all got wrong to one extent or another, was the idea that Donald Trump and Trumpism pose some really grand opportunity to craft an intellectually coherent, post-liberal, post-fusionist policy agenda that that they could use Donald Trump the way the New Republican Herbert Crowley and those guys used Woodrow Wilson. And we saw a lot of people try really hard, and one by one, they either had to cave to utter intellectual incoherence and often corruption, or they had to say, all right, I am not hitching myself to Donald Trump anymore. Because there is no way to be a consistent, philosophically and policy consistent, and actually defend everything that Donald Trump does. There's no safe harbor. The only safe harbor, if you're going to be engaged in active sort of political stuff, is to basically say, I trust Donald Trump's instincts. He is the leader. It's a kind of Americanized Führerprinzip. He is infallible. And I accept all of the contradictions. And some people in the Claremonster world and elsewhere made that bargain and they're happy with it. Or I don't know if they're happy, but they've stuck to it. And then there are other people like Julian Kreintz or whatever who just said, yeah, okay, I'm done being block and tackle for Donald Trump, but here are these ideas I still believe in. And I feel like the second is a more honorable and decent and upholding of what it's supposed to be about public intellectual stuff than the former, but we see a lot more of the former.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. I agree with you that there has not been a successful grafting of any kind of post-fusionist ideology onto Trump, and I don't think that people. I think though the vacuum that we're talking about is going to encourage new attempts. Like I don't think the attempt. I don't think we've seen the end of the attempt to sort of pour wine into the teetotaler Donald Trump's wineskin, right? Because I mean, part of what's weird about this moment, right, is that Trump is probably going to be the Republican nominee. I think that if the economy is pretty good for the next year, that Biden can win. But I think if the election were held today, Donald Trump would be elected president again. And no one has any idea who would staff. I mean, I shouldn't say no idea who would staff his administration, right? Like, yeah, there's sort of a set of people from Stephen Miller on down who would be there in his administration, right? But like, who would be Trump's Secretary of State? Who would be his Secretary of Defense? Who would be his Attorney General? What would
Tom
be
Fitton.
What would his allies in Congress present as like the second term agenda? Trump has sort of made gestures, here and there, but we could have someone elected president whose platform is a vacuum, whose personnel is a mystery. And I think that is actually going to encourage not just, would-be post-liberals, but a lot of different people. I'm actually curious what you think about this. Like, as you don't have to sort of speculate too personally, but do you think that Nikki Haley would accept the vice presidential nomination if offered?
I can't rule it out. It would profoundly disappoint me, but I can't rule it out. And look, and there's an argument.
But one reason would be precisely this, right? That
sure,
if you're Nikki Haley, Trump, again, assuming that there's not going to be a dictatorship and a third term and all these things, Donald Trump will be a lame duck very quickly upon entering the White House. Someone has to run his White House. Someone has to run his policy agenda. I'm sure a lot of people of all kinds of different stripes would talk themselves into trying to fill that role.
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree with you. And this is one of my great frustrations with the sort of hardcore never Trump crowd on certain corners of the right and also vast swaths of the left. For years, they did nothing but defecate from a great height on John Kelly, Bill Barr, William Barr, all those guys who are in Trump's orbit, in his cabinets. And it turns out that, like, they did yeoman service keeping, first of all, getting a lot of good things accomplished, but also keeping the republic on its rails. And they're now all lamenting how terrible a second Trump administration would be, and they're correct. But they say, because they won't have those people around him. He won't have those people around him, those responsible circuit breakers around him. And you would think there'd be just a little more of a mea culpa saying, we were probably too hard on John Kelly and Mark Milley and all of these people who we said were aiding and abetting a dictator, because now we're complaining that when he gets this would-be dictator, when he gets reelected, won't have men of good conscience and caliber like that around him anymore. That has always really bothered me.
Well, there's this idea, and this is part of this ongoing debate about Trump and how to respond to him. But I think there's this idea that if just one more group of elites would condemn Trump a little more wholeheartedly, he would finally be defeated, right? And that's the idea that motivates that kind of complaint about like John.
Why won't the donors just support Nikki, right?
Right.
Like the donors,
if only he had resigned in high dudgeon, 3 weeks in, and denounced Trump and said every bad thing Trump ever said. But I think we see Donald Trump. I mean, I'm in the camp that does not think that January 6th provides a constitutional justification to disqualify Donald Trump. But Donald Trump did, stir up a mob that stormed the Capitol, right? And he was, condemned up and down by Republicans after that. And here we are, and he's at 51% over Joe Biden in a poll. I have no belief in the we just need more elites to act in certain ways theory of defeating Trump. Anyway, sorry.
Well, let me, because we will have so much time. You may even be in the cell next to mine to discuss, the wayward nature of the next Trump administration. And I do think that a second Trump administration poses a much greater threat for the reasons we're discussing now than the first one, in part because the institutions like the Federalist Society are getting sidelined for lawyers who know what time it is and all that kind of garbage, and Trump has a process about finding people whose response to him is, "That's a great idea, sir," not to point out the problems. And lots of bad things can happen with that kind of environment. But let's go broader. I've made a incredibly witty and literary homage reference to your book Decadence earlier, and we're talking about elites. And I think you're absolutely right that there is this weird obsession that says if one more group of elites just stepped in and exerted the power we all know they have, that would fix everything, right? I mean, how many people I've heard from who say, why don't the donors just all rally around Nikki and make her the nominee? And they're giving up. They're revealing their own assumptions about how our system works and think the donors can do that, right? But the donors don't have that kind of power in our system. People will say, I bring this up all the time on here. I've been asked. I used to get asked a bunch. Why did the Republican Party let George Santos run? And the reason is because he filled out a form and showed up. And there are no barriers to entry. And so I'm not going to do my whole weak parties thing again, all that kind of stuff. But as someone who comes from the populist the highbrow, Tony highbrow populist wing of the Republican Party or the conservative movement.
There are dozens of us.
And you have one of these heightened contradiction things of being a man of the people at the New York Times. I'm just kind of curious: is how much of the problem do you think with the way our system is working? How much of it doesn't stem from the fact that um, our elites are too weak, broadly speaking, or the elites that have power don't want to actually be responsible for the power that they wield?
I mean, I think it flows from. I think there's there's sort of a moral critique, right, that you can lodge of how elites themselves approach their roles that our mutual friend Yuval Levin has written a lot about, right? This idea that there just aren't enough people who treat themselves as sort of servants of their own institution, whether it's, the Senate or the courts or the bureaucracy or whatever. There are too many people who want to use those institutions as platforms for their own brands rather than as sort of institutions that are larger than themselves. I think that critique is obviously correct, but it's sort of bound up in just this. I mean, this is not just an American phenomenon, right? Like all over the world, all over the developed world, at least, there is profound disillusionment with elites and establishmentarians and governments and so on. And I think that is connected to the technological age that we live in, right? Maybe we've talked about this before, but Martin Gurry's book, Revolt of the Public, I think, which is basically about how the digital age has sort of exposed institutions in this profound way. Like people know too much about them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's there's sort of no room for anything to happen behind the scenes. There's no behind the scenes, right? It's all transparency, and institutions really can't, they can't maintain public trust in a way if people are too aware of all the sort of human fallibility of what's going on inside them. I think, that's clearly part of what's going on. I mean, I think the world would look different if our elites specifically had made better choices around a variety of different issues. I think American, but especially European elites have mishandled the politics of immigration in profound ways that are just sort of only going to get worse because of demographic trends over the next century. I think the U.S. foreign policy has been deeply unsuccessful in the last 20 years in ways that also, I mean, one problem for Nikki Haley, right, is that wherever you stand on the specific question of aid to Ukraine, she represents a kind of hawkish republicanism that is seen as having a record of failure in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So that's out there. But yeah, I mean, I think we sit at sort of the intersection of some actual policy failures that can be laid at the door of elites and a kind of technological media environment that just makes it really hard to sort of run elite institutions and hold the public trust for any length of time. And I don't know what could happen. I mean, I don't know what could happen to make that situation better. It would be good to have a very successful and popular president for a while. that would probably be helpful, right? And maybe this is sort of maybe part of your case for Haley, that if you got Haley in the Oval Office, maybe she could be very popular and sort of institutionally the Republican Party could recover under her leadership. I would say that a lot of DeSantis's supporters hope for that from him too. So good government from somebody would help. But also the world's not in a great state at the moment, right? I think American power worldwide is under incredible stress. I'm not particularly optimistic about the next 5 years globally. that's not going to be good for sort of elite credibility if the U.S. is seen as sort of losing ground around the world. And anyway, I'm just sort of rambling, but
No, I agree.
those are some of the things. I mean, I think on the particular question of this idea of decadence, that's like my book and sort of the thing I've written about. I mean, it seems like since COVID, if you're looking for sort of optimistic things, right? You could say that, well, since COVID, we've seen some sort of some hopeful technological acceleration, right? Some biomedical progress. Depending on what you think about what AI might do to the world, maybe one can be optimistic about that. Our Jim Pethokoukis, for instance, is, if you want a sort of optimistic libertarian vision of the future, you can go read his stuff. But the social side of things just seems to be, COVID just seems to have delivered its own blow. Like, birth rates are down everywhere, all around the world since COVID, right? It's just like, and we're headed sort of into this really grim demographic spiral all over the world. And I don't know what exactly elites can do about that. Not what they've been doing, but I don't know what the right thing is to do in an environment where you have a lot of really wealthy societies growing old very quickly, dealing with big mass migration pressures, even as declining population means that growth is just going to slow down all over the world. Again, unless we get big technological breakthroughs in the near term.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to come up with we both know people, you're probably one of them, who've been yearning for another great awakening for a while. And at least a great awakening, you can see how it happens. There's been, 4 of them? And the problem with the Great Awakening model is that that's not, I think it would be good if more people were religious, right? For all sorts of reasons. I think the real social movement we need is one that is very difficult to come up with slogans to get a lot of people behind, where the slogans would be something like, everyone stay in your lanes, which is just not really, doesn't thrill people's hearts. But I think the fundamental problem with our institutions, so just to start, I think institutions are kind of like the role that trees play in ecosystems, right? Their roots keep the soil from just being washed away after a big rain. They create sub-ecosystems that people can live in, or that animals and creatures, biomes, can thrive in. They lend themselves to all sorts of biodiversity. And that's what old institutions are supposed to do in a healthy society, is sink roots in that create these niches for weirdness to thrive within them. And the problem with a lot of our institutions today is that they're so overwhelmingly taken over by a strand of leftist thought that that does not want to give up their transgressive, their radical, their revolutionary self-conceptions. And so they use these institutions. I mean, was it that Iowa Hawk had this great summation of this? Is the way what the left does, it takes a venerable institution, kills it, skins it, and then wears its mask around, destroying it and destroying its reputation. And so, like, the Gramscian march through the institutions happened, but none of these people wanted to sort of actually get behind a desk and do the actual job of the institution. They wanted to use the institution to further the revolution, as it were. And that's what has given America what I consider to have is an autoimmune disease, where when you have an autoimmune disease, your body attacks healthy organs as if they're invaders and treats it as if they're infections. And when you see mobs knocking over statues of abolitionists because they were racist, you realize that the autoimmune disease has gone too far, right? When you see that
This is part of the problem for the kind of elite institutions contra Trumpism perspective, right? Is that there is no legitimacy that institutions that have become ideologically radicalized can wield
Right.
against, like, Harvard has no legitimacy to wield against populism, right?
Right.
Like even independent of its president's sort of plagiarism, right? Like, everyone understands that elite American educational institutions are deeply, deeply politicized. We observed during COVID that public health institutions are, or can be under the right constraints, deeply politicized, right? And yes, all of that means that there is no sort of lever to pull against populist critique, because, you know, the populists may be wrong about 1,000 specific details, but they are in fact right that many of these institutions are not worthy of deference and trust.
Yeah. So I mean, I look. Obviously, I agree with that. That's part of my point, and I think that the surest way either party could become a majority party is if a bunch of mayors of one party or the other decided that they could be progressive, not progressive about all sorts of things, but like stop carjacking, fight crime, do something about zoning and housing, right? Solve actual problems, of the sort a young, vibrant, hirsute domed Ross Douthat wrote about, 15 years ago about,
Long ago and
solving
far
people's
away. Right. Yeah.
actual problems, and so I think that, but I'm kind of curious what you think about this, because for complicated reasons we don't have to get into, I've always rejected what people call horseshoe theory because of its roots in this argument about fascism and communism that I think everybody got wrong. You may recall I wrote something about that once upon a time, but I've come to embrace horseshoe theory domestically, because the stuff you're talking about the populists and how Harvard and those institutions have no credibility, forget legitimacy, which I think is a little more loaded, have no credibility with outside of people who already agree with them. I agree with that entirely, and that's a huge problem. The same phenomenon of wanting to politicize and and sort of nightstick every institution on the right into partisan political conformity is happening as well. The problem is like there's just so few conservative institutions that we both know the names of everybody at them, but that's a similar phenomenon that's happening on the right, which is like you have to fall in line for MAGA. We're now seeing the Hugh Hewitt types and these guys start talking about how, you have to, you can't choose, you either choose Joe Biden shredding the Constitution, as I saw Matt Schlapp say this morning, or you choose a great and glorious dear leader. And that same sort of, that's, I think, the sort of this thing that you're right about, that's happening everywhere around the world. Populists, I'm a big Julian Benda guy. The populists the masses are all driving the cars of how elites behave, and elites are following suit. And it's not a right left thing anymore. It is just simply, there go the people, I must go with them, for I am their leader, kind of thing.
Right. Although there is, I mean, if you look at Europe, right, like there's truth to that, but then there's also a way in which populism in power, I guess, bracket the Donald Trump experience, right, and just look at like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, for instance, or to some extent Boris Johnson in the UK, right? That there is a sort of, and you could even say this about, I think, Trump's first terms, and I'm not even bracketing him completely, right? Like there is a way in which sort of, yes, politicians follow their voters in this sort of performative way, but then on substance, like, the populists get into power and don't exactly know what to do, right? And a lot of the time they end up defaulting back to establishment conventional wisdom. So the establishment has this certain weird resilience, notwithstanding the fact that both ends of the voting public dislike it and find it sort of discreditable, right? And yet nonetheless, it endures, right? It's this peculiar thing. Like Giorgia Meloni, is not governing that differently from
Mm-hmm.
how a pre Silvio Berlusconi right of center Italian politician would have governed. She doesn't know what to do in the context of the EU framework and the context of global refugee and human rights law. She doesn't know what to do about immigration, right? She doesn't know what to do about the collapsing birth rate in Italy. She's against it, but she doesn't know what to do about it, right? So there's that problem is woven in too, right? It's not just that sort of everything is becoming so woke or populist. It's that actual governance is just sort of stuck. It doesn't know how to solve the problems it's confronted with.
Yeah, which is part of my argument about why it would be good to have an actual politician, right? I mean, put it this way: like I think you might recall, I had my objections to Bill Clinton, but he was a good politician, right? And there's something to be said. I mean, again, I increasingly find, and I don't want to make it like this sort of hard rule because hard rules get you into trouble, but I often have this instinct of when people say X is the problem. Um, Increasingly, I find that it's not X is the problem, right? It's like people say, "Oh, the elites are too powerful." No, I think the elites are too weak. Oh, parties are too powerful. No, I think parties are too weak. Oh, there isn't enough transparency. No, there's in fact way too much transparency. Oh, we need more democracy. No, actually, we need less democracy. I mean, we need democracy for the things that democracy is for, but not for everything. We're democratizing too many institutions. Um, this idea that the big problem facing America right now is too much censorship of free speech. It's true for some institutions, but on the whole, speech has never been freer. And so on a whole bunch of fronts, people are. I think it's part of this sort of Rousseauian cult of authenticity, where you don't want people to actually be inauthentic when they take over an institution. You want everyone to be themselves and be true to themselves. Well, look, Trump is so authentic to himself. He's an authentic jackass. But the Eisenhower played a role. Bill Clinton played a role. FDR to a certain extent played a role. I mean, it helped for him that he has these super majorities in the House and the Senate, so he got a lot of things done. But the idea that you should play a role for the public is kind of lost in all of this search for authenticity. And good politicians know how to steer disparate coalitions towards positive ends. And this is not a brief necessarily for Nikki Haley, right? That's not the context I'm talking about this in. Good politicians know what their job description is and they do it. And we live in this the populist moment, which exists on both the left and the right, wants everyone to be a rebel and a hero rather than a responsible steward and someone who governs. And I think that's sort of the problem. And telling people, hey, you're going to have to get someone who you're not going to make a shrine to in your basement apartment. He's going to piss you off sometimes, but he's going to get important things done, and he's going to keep the country sort of together and not treat half the country as if they're evil, which is what both parties do now.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just argue with one piece of that, right? I agree with the political analysis 100%. I think you absolutely want politicians who are capable of, as we were talking about before, winning actual majority coalitions. I think those are essential to governing. I think the American system depends on them. That part of the derangement in our politics is our system is just not set up to deal with sort of 48 to 48 ties all the time. And I think it's absolutely the case that we would be better off with stronger institutions in many different aspects of our common life. I don't I don't think you can say we would be better off with more powerful elites. And I know that's not exactly what you're saying, but until you have some idea, some clear idea of how are those elites actually going to master the moment, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
let's say you put Nikki Haley in the White House, right? You've done it. She's won 53% of the vote. She's a good politician. I agree with you. She wins over a bunch of voters who don't normally vote
Right.
Republican.
Expands the
Okay,
Republican majority in the House
expands the
and
Republican
takes the
majority.
Senate. Yeah.
These are good things. What is the elite vision for how you handle? What is the sort of elite center right vision for how you handle America's overlapping challenges? Right, like what right now, like in foreign policy, the United States is under strain from rivals and enemies in the Middle East, in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China and Taiwan, potentially North Korea, right? And the U.S. we're just not in the place we were when Bill Clinton was president.
Mm-hmm.
He was very successful in part because we were in a really
Right.
really strong position, right? And so when I look at like the sort of the Republican foreign policy, the elite Republican foreign policy vision that presumably Nikki Haley would embody, it seems to be like caught in a time warp where it's like, well, we're going to stand up to Putin, and we're going to stand up to the mullahs, and we're going to stand up to North Korea, and we're going to stand up to China. And the U.S., we're in a bad strategic position at the moment compared to where
Mm-hmm.
we were 20 years ago. You have to have some sort of Nixonian, like, I'm not saying exactly what the strategy should be, but some sort of Nixonian realism about who you're going to play off against each other, which bad guys you're going to support, which theaters you're going to sort of seek an uncomfortable peace in, all of that, right? And maybe in office Nikki Haley would come up with that strategy, but I don't think there's some like ready-made, if we just got sort of Mitt Romney and Elliot Abrams or Elliot Cohen, maybe not Elliot Abrams, Elliot Cohen, right? Some group of sort of Ukraine hawk Republicans together, that they would have a strategy to deal with this landscape. I don't have any confidence that they have a strategy, that sort of the Haley part of the party has a strategy. And that's one example. I would say something similar about immigration, economic policy, and so on. I don't think elites have a strategy at the moment. And I'm
Yeah. So
not
I
saying
think,
I know what the strategy should be, but I'm just saying,
yeah,
like,
I mean,
I don't, yeah.
so not to give offense, but a close, one might even say Straussian reading of your last statement, which I agree with in large part, is you're sort of switching horses back and forth between my point about elites and your concerns and problems with the sort of Haley wing of the Republican Party. Because I could do the exact same thing that you did about Ron DeSantis and JD Vance, right? That they don't know what they would do either. I mean, Ron DeSantis is talking about how we're going to shoot people trying to come into the country. We're talking about, we got people in that wing talking about how we're going to use the military against, we don't want any more forever wars, but we're actually going to make the drug war a hot war in Mexico and Colombia. I'm not saying that we shouldn't necessarily use military force, but it's a lot of red mate, boob bait, pandering to audiences that want to hear this stuff. The way they talk about fentanyl's a huge friggin' problem. Most fentanyl is not brought in by these people swarming the border. It's brought in through checkpoints. But that runs inconvenience. Vivek Ramaswamy is talking about using the military at the northern border. I mean, it is incoherence, Fox News audience pandering all over the place in the anti-Haley side as well. And so I agree with you entirely. People should figure this stuff friggin' out. I agree with that entirely. But this idea that somehow the elites that you want to supplant, in the sort of Republican conservative firmament with more grounded populist type elites, they haven't figured a lot of this stuff out because these problems are hard, but neither have the people that you'd like to replace them with. and we can't have a debate about what that should look like, what that new consensus should be, so long as Donald Trump is saying that he would end the Ukraine-Russia war in 24 hours, right? Because it anybody who actually wants to talk about the hard questions and the details and the second order and third order steps required to solve some of these problems is just going to get picked off by some talk radio schmo or cable news host or by Donald Trump for trying to make this sound harder than it needs to be. Because that's the problem. And this is the thing I've always thought you guys were wrong about populism, is that you're making an elitist argument for populism, and that's fine, but the elites still need to be the ones to figure out what's good for the populi. And the problem is that in politics, if you say you're going to ride populists into power, and you're not incredibly disciplined and incredibly self-aware of what you're doing, what you're going to end up doing is catering to the crowd rather than using the crowd towards productive ends. And that's what Bernie Sanders' vision is. That's what Donald Trump's vision is. That's what that's what Heritage Foundation is becoming. It's focus grouping what the MAGA people want to hear, what the populists want to hear, and delivering it rather than actually thinking through what you guys were trying to do with the reform conservatism stuff, which was responsible and coherent and a way to forestall populist overreach rather than by actually helping real people. And instead, what we have now is a politics of utter pandering to populist mob sentiment. And I'm enough of a self-aware elitist to say, I don't like crowds. I don't like mobs. I don't like telling people that all the problems that we have in the world are really easy if we just get the right people in to fix them. And that's the sort of rhetoric of our politics today.
But weren't you just defending the idea that people need to be good at politics? And isn't part of being... This is not a brief for Ron DeSantis, who clearly is not that good at politics, right? We can say that. But surely a successful politician has to figure out some kind of balance here, right? Where, I mean, Clinton was actually quite good at figuring out how to blend a certain degree of pandering with a certain degree of policy nuance, wrapping the two together. And voters really liked that. I don't know if there are enough. As I said earlier, I'm skeptical that there are tons and tons of voters in the Republican coalition who want that, and I am deeply I don't have a plan, Jonah, for fixing the situation. Yeah. I'm just very doubtful of the current state of I'm doubtful about the current state of elite conventional wisdom. That's all. I'm not saying to the point. I'm not like I do. Like I wish. Look, I do think I'll probably write a piece about this at some point. I do think I would be more comfortable with a Ron DeSantis foreign policy than a Nikki Haley foreign policy, mostly because I feel like DeSantis has sent signals that he has, that he wants to think more about trade-offs in foreign policy than Haley has done. But I agree with you that those sort of trade-off sort of realist signals are wrapped together with a bunch of posturing about what we're going to do with Mexico that, if actualized, would be its own kind of disaster. So I agree. I don't think...
that's all fair. And again, I think a Ron DeSantis presidency, I think he would, if he were consistent with some of the things he says, I think there's a unfortunate risk that he would completely screw Ukraine, which I think would be very bad. But that's a discrete policy thing. Generally speaking, I wouldn't catastrophize a DeSantis foreign policy. I mean, there was more continuity between Obama's foreign policy and Bush's foreign policy than people realize, and there was more continuity between Obama's foreign policy and Trump's foreign policy for the sort of the same reasons that you're getting at with Giorgia Meloni. It's like it turns out that once you're behind the desk, the range of options you have to do stuff is fairly constrained and the solutions are fairly limited, and you end up going in generally the same sort of direction. I mean, I think the realists are full of crap, but this idea that sort of that nations follow their interests to a certain extent, regardless of who's in charge, there's some merit to that. Obviously, there's some explanatory power. And so I agree with you in the sense that I wouldn't want just elites to be more powerful. I would not want to give Claudine Gay from 6 months ago a lot more power, right? I would not want to give the Ford Foundation and these places a lot more power. But so part of my point is that the elites, not only we need more powerful elites, but we also need elites with a much more robust sense of responsibility about their own institutions and what they're there for. And you can't have one without the other. And so that's where I'm sympathetic to the populists. If the people running a lot of these institutions are going to abuse their power, they should be thrown out. But I don't think that they should be replaced with people of populist sensibilities. I think they should be replaced with as many clones of Yuval Levin as we can come up with, right? People who actually care about the actual institutions that and the job. They should be able to answer the question from Office Space, what would you say you do here? And I don't remember, about 10 years ago under Obama, the head of NASA was asked what his top priority was. And it was all about, like, it wasn't DEI, but it was sort of like,
was it climate
about
change?
climate change and like racial inclusion or something like that. And it's like, no, your job is to put rockets in space. And that's the sort of what I'm getting at. But I agree with you. There's not a consensus on the old Reaganite right, and there's not a consensus. But I also don't think there's a consensus on the DeSantis side either. And we could get to one that wouldn't make you entirely happy or me entirely happy if Donald Trump wasn't soaking up all of the oxygen and all of the seriousness out of Republican politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're making a pretty strong case for general pessimism. I feel like I had my phase as a pundit and hack writer and policy analyst where I thought I was part of a project to build a worldview that could be usefully adopted by some future Republican administration. And that phase sort of ran from 2006 to 2016. And then in the Trump presidency, there were a bunch of sort of bright young populists who came in and said, things that I agreed with, right? That we're going to have, now we're going to build the sort of working class Republican coalition, that you wanted originally, Ross. And my response to them was often a sort of like dour skepticism about their plans for, realignment and transformation, right? And I think some of those people have come around to more skepticism in the last few years. But I do not currently see a path beyond the sudden emergence of some unexpected political talent, which I think neither DeSantis nor Haley are on the right, towards radically transforming the situation for the better. I think that I think American politics in general is likely to be sort of a prisoner of unfortunate events in the near term. And I think grand plans of all kinds are going to be defeated by that reality, no matter who is elected president this year. So how's that for pep and optimism?
So buy gold.
Yeah.
Well, we have Nick Catoggio on staff now, so like we normally
right,
I don't have to go.
That's the pure uncut pessimism.
I usually don't have to outsource my Eeyore fix to you, but like there we are. Ross Douthat, thank you so much for doing this. I know you got to run. Always great to have you. I hope you'll come back because I did want to talk to you about UFOs, but another time.
Next, I will come back and talk about UFOs, Jonah. I promise. When you're ready. When you're prepared.
Okay. When my loins are sufficiently girded against That's probing right. And everything else. Ross Douthat, thanks again for coming.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Jonah. It was fun.